Hey, welcome to the second installment of our John Baker Day conversations this year. Normally, we throw a big party, play a lot of rock and roll, and raise money for a worthy cause. But this year, because of 2020 being 2020, we decided to do something more important and hopefully more productive this year. So I'd like to thank all of our panel for being here today, especially our guests, Doug Glanville, who is a former Cubs major league ball player, played for the Phillies and the Rangers, 9-year baseball career. He's a university professor. He's got a degree in engineering. He's a New York Times op-ed columnist, a Hamilton the musical enthusiast, a Hall & Oates super fan. Like there's the list goes on of this man's accomplishments. And we're here with Sarah Sanchez from Bleed Cubby Blue, Levante Stewart from Lost Boys Inc., who is our beneficiary this year of everything that we could do to help out his organizations, which runs a little league on the southwest side of Chicago. Corey Finneran from Ivy Envy, and of course, Mr. John Baker, the man who got it all started by getting the win in 2014 in the 16th inning in a random game as the backup catcher. So, thanks all for being here on this morning, and we're going to have a conversation about Black baseball in Chicago. This is the section where we talked to Bob Kendrick last time we all spoke, and this time we're talking to Doug Glanville. We had a fascinating conversation about the Negro League Baseball Museum, about the history of Chicago, about redlining, about a lot of the challenges that those players had to face, and also the triumphs that they were able to accomplish through before the last turn of the last half century. So Doug, I just want to start with you. You're from Teaneck, New Jersey. You've talked a lot about that in a lot of the interviews you've done, and I feel like you come at things with a very unique perspective because of growing up in Teaneck, just outside of Manhattan, just over the George Washington Bridge. And I know you've talked a lot about how Teaneck was one of the first communities that voluntarily integrated. And I'd like to ask how you feel that experience kind of affected your perspective on baseball, on race, and especially with your coaches being policemen. And I don't know, just if you could speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, Dan, and well, it's great to be on. Thanks for having me. And a great cause, and important that we keep advancing these conversations. And it's an unbelievable, unprecedented time. I know most of us are kind of inside, but we've been able to reflect a lot, and some of these conversations and really actions behind them are long overdue and important as we kind of create our own future here. And looking back in my life, a lot of what we're engaging on now kind of circles back to my experience, at least the way that I approach these engagements. And for example, so as you mentioned, Teaneck, New Jersey, voluntarily desegregated in the early 60s. And they used a sixth grade program. It's like a pilot program to integrate Black and white students. And they found that the town was very receptive to it. And they started to roll it out beyond the sixth grade. And so I came along in 1970, went through the school system. And by then it was fairly refined. They had addressed housing issues and all these ways they approached it. So that my experience growing up in Teaneck was very diverse. And it wasn't just like the sort of buzzword company line diversity. It was truly inclusive. We were in, little league teams and churches or wherever, and we just saw different walks of life engaging. And I think the law enforcement side of that was when I played in the summer league team. Our famous team was the Teaneck Lancers, and my brother was on this team. He's 7 years older. And I was like, oh, I got to be a Lancer. Well, the Lancers were run by Gene O'Reilly, who was a volunteer detective from the Teaneck Police Department. And in fast forwarding, I think 6 or 7 of our teammates between my brother and I became police officers, including the chief of police currently in Teaneck, who was my teammate. And so it kind of created this constructive engagement around law enforcement where I had access in a way that is somewhat unusual, right? We know a lot of Black communities are in over policed areas and there's a tension. But in this case, I was, on a common ground, right, as a teammate ultimately with people who became law enforcement or who were actually law enforcement at the time. And so I, went over police officers' homes, and it was just sort of a normal thing. And I didn't know how unusual that was until kind of later in life. And that didn't mean that I didn't have experiences that made my hair raise with police officers. It's just that I had context that these type of interactions could go differently. It didn't have to be negative. It could be community built. It could be positive. It could be a lot of things. And so, so it was sort of a window into sports being part of the solution, an opportunity to be teammates with people from different backgrounds, different professions, and see eye to eye because you do have this common goal. And so, when I had experiences after that point, it informed me in that way. And so the bigger issues that we face, whether George Floyd or, personally things that have happened to me, whether shoveling my driveway and all these things that have gone down, that let me think, okay, wait a minute. Now I have a different context that I can see a solution where this can work and this can be a positive and that we can develop something constructive for all of us. And it certainly mattered. My father was a psychiatrist, and part of his practice was helping out law enforcement or police officers that had dealt with the stress of their job. So at a young age, I knew that their jobs were very difficult, and that also kind of helped me. So yeah, fast forward, I'm on the police council in Connecticut. I just got off of a meeting because they have a huge new police accountability act that was passed to reform policing in the state, which I think had already done a fairly decent job around a lot of these issues. So it's kind of come together. And I always say this about baseball or sport in general: it's a team concept with people from different backgrounds, often, especially at the big league level. And it's obsessed with equity because you have rules that are supposed to be applied fairly across the board. And to me, that's all the more reason you shouldn't stick to sports, because sports to me is a great example aspirationally of what our society could aspire to be, because you have this sense of equity and rules and fairness. You also have people learning how to work together. And those who are exposed to sports in that environment understand to their core about what it takes to win and how important it is to respect each other.
And how important do you think is that exposure that you had at a young age to people of different races and also the police? I mean, how important is that in, like, I guess, forming your view of what diversity actually looks like? And Levante, I'm hoping you can speak on this afterwards, is because I know that might be a different situation, but also something you are striving to do with Lost Boys and expose the kids on your team to different cultures and around the city of Chicago. Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I was. I think I was waiting on Doug to kind of reply on the first part of the question. And I'm sitting here kind of starstruck, man. It's Doug Glanville and John Baker. I'm like, I'm trying to get in the conversation here. But yeah, it's really, yeah, what Doug said. It's a really big part of what we do, and it plays a significant role. Like Doug said, we have, for example, a young man. He's 21 years old now. Thank you. He turned 21, and we drank our first beer with him last week. And but he's a young man that came through our program. We retained him because that is a big feature of our program, and he became a coach. He's currently a pitcher at Harris Stowe University there in St. Louis, HBCU. And so, of course, he's home right now. But for the past 3 years or so, this young man has been talking about and has been going down the path of, after baseball, I want to be in law enforcement. I want to either be an Illinois state trooper or I want to be a Chicago Police Department. And this kid Jalil is huge, man. Like 6'9", something like that. Really big kid. 260, 265, solid. He'd make a great cop, I think. But a lot of it was due to the involvement that we intentionally had with law enforcement to offset the negative views and stereotypes, that kind of radiate out of the Black community in terms of the relationship with police. Now, one thing that people have to know, whether they know or not, that hasn't fully existed in that way forever. Like Doug said, when I was a kid, cops were coaches in Little League. There was just a much better relationship in, Black communities with law enforcement. And so I'm just only about 5 years younger than Doug. And so, we probably kind of came up in that same era of seeing things. And Doug, I had a very close friend I went to college with that's from Teaneck, New Jersey. Unfortunately, he passed away while we were young and in college. But that was, that's really critical with what we do. Some of our coaches have been local law enforcement. So we've seen very tangible results and impact from doing that over the years. So probably the biggest one is that there becomes recognition between the young people and law enforcement in the community. So, for example, we had a kid stopped a couple of years ago. And so initially the engagement was a bit aggressive, but once they saw all this baseball gear and they're like, where you play ball, kid? And so he's like, yeah, I play for this organization, Lost Boys. We're part of Rosemore Little League. And so immediately it softened how they were dealing with him. They said, oh yeah, we know Lost Boys. Craig Thompson, our officer from the 4th District, he coaches over there. His son plays over there. Levante and Frank. And so it went from, kind of an aggressive adversarial stop to one where they were laughing, joking, and they even offered the kid a ride home at the end of the day. And so that kid's name was Brian. And he was another kid after that experience that said, you know what, coach, I'm really thinking I might want to be a cop. And so, that was the goal, was to kind of begin to change the perception in the community of the police, and to get the police to look at the kids and start changing their perception of them as well, right? Because we know there's all kind of evidence that speaks to it, but typically, a lot of people that are not Black, when they see specifically young Black men, they're oftentimes looked at as older than what they are, and the response towards them, the treatment, is much harsher. You'll treat a 13-year-old like a 20-year-old, when a 13-year-old really just needs to be treated like a 13-year-old.
I think Tamir Rice is kind of I think the biggest example of that, being shot in Cleveland with a toy pistol. Doug, I got to ask too, like, because you're so involved, you're on the police council. I know you were working on something that had to do with excessive force, or working out when force can be used and when force can't be used. I don't know if you could speak on that, because it might not be a done deal right now. But what I'm wondering is, how did you decide to become involved with law enforcement? Was it your early exposure to police and being close with them? And I know your father, they gave him a kind of a hero's send off for his funeral. So what exactly was it that made you interested? And then you had your own situations and run-ins with the law based upon, unfair profiling, so is that what made you get involved to make things better, or?
Yeah, I mean, well, it definitely was, I use it in my class. We call it like these social justice moments, right? So, I mean, sometimes you're just trying to mind your business and you're not really thinking proactively about it. You're just, and this is how sometimes these things happen, right? And I think it can put a circle around the dynamics of race sometimes in our country, where you can be doing something innocuous and innocent, and it could go badly very quickly. In my case, how I got involved with Connecticut was, I wrote about this in the Atlantic, but I was just shoveling my driveway in Hartford, Connecticut. Excuse me. And then for those of you who know the Northeast at all, Hartford is the capital. It's in the kind of north central part of the state. And it's kind of surrounded by rivers and mountains. It's really trapped. And the town directly to the west is called West Hartford. And Northeasterners know like how provincial the states are, right? So every town is like you're in a different planet, right? They have their own police force, their own school, all that. So it's a big deal when you cross town lines. And so we happen to live a block from the border of West Hartford in Hartford. Now, Hartford demographically is a black and brown city, a lot of poverty. And then you have this kind of one neighborhood that's, probably where the large percentage of white residents live, but it's also the power brokers because they have, it's the governor, this is the capital. So the seat of government. I mean, this place has, state senators and everything, right? So we actually liked it for the historic district. We liked old houses, so we didn't really always make those connections. So long story short, we only had been living there about a year, and I go outside in the snow after 4 snow days of my kids being trapped in the house, which now seems like normal. I was like, I got to get this minivan out of this driveway if I have to push it out of here, right? So I go outside. It's 3:00 in the afternoon. It's literally 0 degrees. And my wife is happy that I'm doing it because I'm always like, I'll get it later, whatever. So I go out to shovel and I get to the end of my driveway and I look up and there's a police cruiser across the street. And I was like, and I'm very good with cars. So I'm like, that's like a Ford Interceptor, whatever. And it says West Hartford instead of Hartford. Now, and if you're in the South, like Raleigh, these regional police forces, you don't really think anything of it. But in Connecticut, that's like a big deal. Why is there an officer from another town across the street? So I'm watching this guy he's in his cruiser. He's kind of fiddling and sat there for a while. So I just go back to shoveling, start shoveling again, big coat, haven't shaved in days. And I look up and this officer's crossing the street. And I remember he was wearing that kind of ski mask thing. His eye, it wasn't just his eyes, just all you could see is his face. Clean shaven. He had to be in his late 20s, a young guy. And so his white guy, black guy, I'm shoveling, crosses the street. So I kind of stand up and I thought it was going to be like, hey, where's Elizabeth Park or just anything, right? And he says, so kind of very aggressively, so you're trying to make some extra bucks shoveling people's driveway around here? I mean, that's how he started. That was the first thing he said. So I was like, whoa, wait a minute. So now once again, I still had time to think, okay, I've had a lot of good experiences with law enforcement. And I also knew that my response was going to dictate a lot of my future. So I said, all right, I can't tell this guy to get off my driveway. I got to kind of be cool. And I just said, well, look, no, I'm in my own driveway and trying to shovel, small talk. He didn't really respond. And then eventually minutes went by and he finally said, happy shoveling, and took off. So he never really explained why he was there or introduced himself or apologized or whatever. He was gone. Now, I didn't know what he was looking for. He might have been in some pursuit. I had no idea, but it was pretty shocking and felt like I was like something was stolen from me. I guess it's the best description because, you have this sort of sanctuary of your own property and your home, and you're kind of doing a service. You're on, taking care of your house, and you're not thinking of much else. And that's how quickly it changed. So, long story short, I mean, it was an ordeal for 18 months, but in the end, we started. I think when I tapped that experience, I mentioned this exposure to police and had this sort of positive history. It informed how I was even going to approach it. So I kind of decided fairly quickly to just collaborate. And my neighbors called a meeting with West Hartford Police, and we kind of started there. I ended up meeting the Hartford chief, and there was a lot of stonewalling, and there was certainly a lot of like denials at first, and had to kind of cut through a lot of that chase. But in the end, I took 2 months to talk to different people around the incident, from lawyers, police, citizens, community leaders. And I got educated about the laws that govern, because I was like, well, can he even be over here? I had to understand all this. And in the end, I wrote an article for The Atlantic, and it did really well and got a lot of traction. And West Hartford at first was kind of trying to let it go away, but they started to kind of deal with it. And it ended up leading to legislation about defining crossing town lines and jurisdictional sort of protocols. And it ended up passing about 18 months later as the Glanville law, right, in the state of Connecticut, about jurisdiction. And what was interesting is people asked about, well, it could have been a racial profiling. And I saw pretty quickly that was a non-starter to actually get this passed, because racial profiling can be, depending on your state, someone could say, okay, you can't, arrest someone based on the sole factor of being race. So what they say is, well, no, it wasn't just your race; it was that you had an umbrella with you, right? So you realize that there's ways around, and racial profiling from a societal standpoint versus legal are very different. So I knew that there was a profiling component to it, but legally is a different standard. So I had the state rep do research on what laws governed my experience, and a lot of it was about jurisdiction. Can you even be here? Like messing with citizens from another town over what? And it turned out this guy was looking for, there was some snow shoveling dispute, like that was sort of the word, snow shoveling dispute from some guy like weeks prior. And they called the police, and it was just over like pay or money. They called the police, they responded and said, hey, if this guy comes back, call us or something. So it was very protracted. It turned out a guy who looked like this guy kind of came back, and the person, the woman that originally called wasn't even home. So the neighbor called. So you can see how far we're going here, right? Wasn't the same guy, it was weeks later, wasn't even the woman that it happened to. It was a neighbor looking through the window who thought it might have been the same guy. And off of that alone, the police responded and drove over town lines in pursuit, because she said, I think he headed that way. And so it was a snow shoveling, and there's no ordinance against snow shoveling. There's a solicitation, but it's not, you don't arrest somebody. It's a ticket, so you're going to go on pursuit for a guy, it was just bananas. And it was very interesting, learning about the dynamics of the politics behind it and so on. But generally it was, so how did I end up on the council? Well, it resolved very well, and it passed unanimously, ultimately through the Senate by decree, consent decree, I guess they call it. And I think they were appreciated that it was inclusive of all different parties. I met with community leaders, different political leaders, both sides, whatever, Republican, Democrat, didn't matter. And I think it brought a lot of people together. By the end, West Hartford Board of Education, we were talking, and my article was used in classrooms and so on. So that led the governor to notice, and that's a governor's appointment. So he called at one point, or reached out and said, hey, would you like to join this? And this council is very powerful. It sets certification, decertifying officers, training. I mean, the whole 9 yards we're responsible for. And it's one of the few in the country that has community members in it. They're not just law enforcement. So it was a long game, but it spoke to the importance of bringing people along with you to invest in the outcome. And it's amazing how that process alone was equally, if not more valuable than the outcome. One short story before I stop talking here is a month after the article came out, I got kind of ripped by a local, pretty strong personality on NPR. Rip might be strong, but it was critical of my writing about this. Almost like, you're not really from here. You just got here. You don't know how things go. Your neighborhood would probably do the same thing, which may have been true. But he also was sort of like, and you weren't shot, you weren't tasered. This happened to my son who's Latino. He went through this list. The white guy who I think he adopted his son, if I'm not mistaken, but he was very in tune with some of these issues, but kind of dismissed it like, you know what, it could have been worse. And Don Cheadle was one of the examples, who I guess got arrested for mistaken bank robber or something in Hartford or whatever. So he blew it off. And I mean, you talk about divine intervention here. A couple months later, I go to a charity event and he's emceeing, right? So my wife was livid. She was writing a counter, like, we're going to bury this guy. How dare he say, like, this is no big deal. And I said, go ahead. But we kind of decided not to respond. I said, well, let's just see how it plays out. And, remember, we're new to this neighborhood relatively. So I go to this charity event. He's emceeing. So we're at a table and I go up to him. I say, hey, Colin, just want to put the name to the face, Doug Glanville, just nice to meet you and appreciate your work. And that was it. And he like turned white like a ghost. Like because he kind of put it together that, wow, this I kind of trashed this guy, right? And so he calls me up to kind of co-MC, and we exchanged information. And I just explained a couple things, but it was all calm, didn't really dig into it. And then the dominoes fell. It was like Ferguson, Eric Garner, it was like boom, 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 boom. And to his credit, he called a year-end show. It was like the year in review on NPR. And he said, I've learned a lot. And one of which is they should have treated him like a witness, not a suspect. And innocent things go badly for people of color in these exchanges. Because he saw like, okay, Eric Garner, cigarettes and, jaywalking and Skittles and all these things, that it can go like that. So you better be mindful of these unnecessary exchanges with all this bias dripping off of it. So, so that's sometimes patience is part of it. And we don't have a lot of patience in the Twitterverse. And I think it's the outcomes can be so much more robust and sustainable when you bring as many people along as you can with you, and because it's not just about you in the end. So in short, yes, it was really powerful, and this group is great. I mean, I love working on this council. We got a lot done, and it's composed of a lot of different people, and I think it's a good model going forward.
Cool. I know Corey had a question. I have a piece of something that you wrote for the New York Times talking about checking boxes with stereotypical box checking in the clubhouse. And I'll just read it real quick. So the player from Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, the player from rural Nebraska, and the player from Detroit all evoke certain preconceived notions. Today, especially in much of our American stereotypical box checking discourse on identity, those geographic and cultural truths can prevent us from seeing the frequent counter narratives to our biases, those revealed from real intimacy and consistent proximity through a unified goal. Team discord is sowed when we are reduced to living exit polls tied to a sound bite or the color of a state, like red and blue. So I know Corey wanted to talk a little bit about, kind of what that meant. And John, you could probably speak on this too, within a clubhouse and, the dynamics of that.
Yeah, anybody watching or listening, I'd strongly suggest that you read that article that you wrote, Doug. It was really good. It was from the New York Times right before the 2018 season, entitled "Don't Judge Baseball Players by Their Metrics or Their Background." And yeah, in that piece, you shared some of the clubhouse dynamics as these players from very different backgrounds are essentially living with each other for months. And I think the future of baseball and the health of the game depends on that multiculturalism that is in the game. And I'd be interested in hearing more of your thoughts on that positive impact that from bringing together players from different backgrounds. And the second part of my question is, I think the conversation around multiculturalism in baseball tends to gravitate towards a mindset of American-born players and players from Latin America. And when people hear American-born players, I think that is often interpreted as white players. In 1956, 6.7% of Major League Baseball players were Black. Here, 64 years later, that percentage has gone up 1 whole percentage point, up to 7.7%. And I think one of the reasons for this is the role that travel ball and private coaching is playing in youth baseball right now. And a kid with a lot of talent at 9 or 10 who doesn't come from a family with the financial means to participate in these activities, they don't really have the same opportunities because and therefore they aren't part of that pipeline, I guess. And this is one of the reasons that we're supporting Lost Boys. And personally, as a believer in community baseball, I'm the president of our small town baseball association. I've coached softball and baseball in the past. I know the difference in the quality of coaching a kid gets from me versus the quality of coaching a kid gets from Levante is much different. Levante is a much better coach than I am. I have no doubt. And so, we're thrilled to be able to help Levante's players, and so I guess my question to you is: do you believe that this travel ball showcase environment is really hurting the racial, cultural, and economic diversity in the game, and what can baseball do, and what can just people, fans of the sport do to keep baseball from becoming a sport that is primarily something for the haves, not the have-nots?
Yeah, I mean, I know, Bake, you want to jump in? I know you're, constantly. I see you popping in and out there.
Well, I don't know what's going on with my St. Louis internet is boring. I'm
yeah.
having trouble. I'm having trouble figuring it out. But I would actually like to address what Corey just said. Years ago, when I was still playing, I had a chance to go down and visit Daryl Miller, who runs the RBI program in Compton. And then also kind of that experience working with reviving baseball in the inner city, but also going to school. I'm fortunate enough to have gone to school at 3 different times. At the turn of the century at Berkeley, where I got to take a Harry Edwards Sociology of Sport class. And then again, when I went back to school, when I stopped playing in 2017, I took another one of those classes, but from Arizona State. And my dad's college roommate and athletic director there, Ray Anderson, was helpful in that space as well. And then again, taking it here for in graduate school for performance psychology, taking the sociology of performance basically. And one of the things that stands out about baseball, and Dave Zirin has written about it, and Harry Edwards obviously has written about it, but what you see is we outsourced our talent development to Latin America. And when we talked about this with Bob last week, but when you look at the best players in the history of Major League Baseball, there's a pretty consistent theme when you think about Barry Bonds and Willie Mays and Hank Aaron and Bob Gibson. You think about those people and you go, man, from the 7 or 6% of the population of Major League Baseball, where did those guys come from? Where are they from? And you see really quickly that some of the best players, if not the best players that we've ever had, are people of color. And we've done baseball as a business, and the best thing that we've done or the worst thing that we've done that's involved with business is we've said we can sign people that can play defense. We can sign people of color from foreign countries for much cheaper. We can bring them here, and therefore we do not have to invest in the same kind of programs internally. So there's like a broad systemic issue to it. And when it comes to travel ball, yeah, I mean, growing up in the suburbs, we didn't really have it at my age, but you see it a lot now. And my nephews who played baseball when they were younger, they all went through it, and they start talking about $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 to be able to play for the summer, get you in front of these coaches. And you can see how financial resources provide just extremely larger opportunities for kids from areas of the people that have. And I don't know solutions, which is why we're having these conversations. I wish I had solutions to these issues. I wish that Major League Baseball did a better job of putting money in places that actually service the community. I think that's a second part of it. That's why, when we started talking about this day this year and the things that we were going to do, and that's one of the things we've always done with this is we've always given back to people within the community. Last year, the Chicago Battered Women's Network, because we had gone through, I had the experience of confronting domestic violence head on. And now this year, after the horrifying incident that we all watched on TV with George Floyd, we thought, how do we take the small platform that we have, and how do we put that attention back into our community, for the Chicago Cubs, because of our history of Cap Anson refusing to take the field in the 30s, because of the East-West Negro League All-Star Game in 1933 that had 50,000 people, because of the legacy of Buck O'Neil, and even on the South Side, Minnie Minoso, the Latin Jackie Robinson. We have this rich history, but it's like we've forgotten to fuel the resources that contributed to that rich history. We've let it go, and I think that it's one thing that we don't have resources for kids in tough places to get nice bats and gloves and stuff and play, but can we solve that problem before we recognize the importance of Buck O'Neil in Chicago? The first black coach in 1962 to be on the field, who didn't get a chance to manage the team. They brought the bullpen coach in front of him. That's our real legacy. I think it's confronting that first, confronting our history first, before we can make some positive change for these kids in the future. And in having these conversations, Doug, and I appreciate so much you sharing your story. You know, I've read the article in the Atlantic and followed all the things that you've written. I hope that gives more power to people's willingness to commit to programs like Lost Boys, because I think that's actually how we make the change. Corey, to answer that question, how do we do better? We take whatever platforms we have and we amplify the voices and the organizations that make an actual difference, that money actually goes to the kids that need those resources, that don't have them. And perhaps in the future, it's something to do with little leagues and other of those travel organizations where they have companion programs on the other side of town. They have what do we say? We have the Hartford and the West Hartford baseball teams are exposed to the same resources and the same coaching and the same relationship with the police department. That is the path forward. The inclusion has to be systemic, just as the racism was that got us here in the first place.
If I can jump in and piggyback on that, John, as a guy who loved baseball but didn't, made it nowhere near as far as yourself and Doug, I see a couple of things, right? Yeah, travel ball plays a very critical part, I think, in the overall decline in Black youth, particularly playing the sport. But I also think it's an easy way to scapegoat it, right? And here's why I say that. First of all, in any sport that we play, there is always a separation. What do they say? Cream rises to the top. So your top players in any sport are always going to stand out, and there are always going to be opportunities for them to really shine on that higher level. So, I look at travel ball teams as sort of like, just roving all-star teams. And yes, it has grown into a multi-billion-dollar predatory industry. That's what that is about. That is that part of American capitalism that sucks, where it just says, oh, you parents are willing to pay, $1,500 a summer or $5,000 a year for us to coach a kid, and we would have did this for free. Yeah, we'll take your $5,000, and so this industry has emerged, and a lot of people are really lining their pockets from it, which again is capitalism. I'm not upset at people, it's business, but I think there's a careful, there's a point that you have to get at and understand the business from how important just providing youth baseball and sports and outlets like this, how important that is for children. But I think also more so than the travel ball and the cost of baseball. We always mention the cost of baseball. But when I was growing up, man, in Chicago, there was strikeout boxes on the back of every wall. Danny, I think we were kind of talking about this a couple of days ago. And everybody plays strikeout. Boys, girls, the local grocer would come out and take a couple of swings. Your grandma would get out there and show you that she still has some pop left in that baby. So, it was baseball was American life. Like they say, it was as American as apple pie. And so something happened. What has happened? We haven't completely figured it out, but I think one of the biggest parts, and I can say this now, I'm speaking as a former player. Again, Doug is young, and just a little bit older than me. Doug, when you entered the league, I think I was, starting my college career in football and baseball. I excelled more in football than I did baseball. I was a left-hander. I modeled my game from you. I played center field. I learned everything starting really watching Doug Glanville as I got off into college ball, and I needed to really try to get better because I really, really wanted to play further. I never made it past like semi-pro. I played for the Tulsa Braves down in Oklahoma, and that was kind of it. I went to school in Missouri and then ended up in prison. I kind of tell my story. But one of the things that I think was critical about it was representation. To be able to look at that TV and see an Andre Dawson, a Sean Dunston, a Doug Glanville out here, playing the game, interacting with fans, that was really important as kids. And so when we went out to play, you emulated those people that we saw on the television, right? If you hit a dinger, you're like, yeah, I'm Dawson, baby. And so, or Barry Bonds, and it's and then it changed. It really started changing. I mean, that decline started again, and the representation started changing again. And the players that we thought were black, we would later find out when they opened their mouth, they didn't speak a lick of English. And you're like, oh, wait a minute, he's from the DR. So I think one of the things for black youth is it was much easier to turn on the NBA and the NFL and see Michael, Magic, Deion Sanders, Warren Moon, and et cetera, right? And you started seeing more representation in those sports. So to me, my opinion, I think kids began to gravitate towards those other sports where there was a higher percentage of black representation. So it was easy to say, I want to be like Mike, because you saw Mike and you saw Magic and you saw Allen Iverson and so forth. So I think for a lot of kids, in my experience, the kids I work with, that's often what they talk about. A lot of them don't even watch baseball. And I'm like, we're going through a thing now, like, who's your favorite player? We're trying to get Tim Anderson to do something with us and, and just get them excited about having a favorite player. So, yeah, that's kind of what I see is I think representation became a really big thing. What Corey talked about, that percentage, that is so critical.
I think even beyond representation, one of the questions that I had, Doug, and John, you may be able to speak to this too. Rob Arthur over at Baseball Prospectus has been doing a lot of work looking at the statistics in the minor leagues and the scouting systems, and in how players are valued and how players are evaluated as they make their way through the system. He published absolutely outstanding piece about a month ago looking at how the white players make it to the big leagues and make it up every level of the minor league system about a year earlier than their Black or Latino counterparts. And so there's a lag there where he kind of evaluated the statistical universe of players over a decade and found that Black players are losing about 1/8 of a season relative to their white counterparts, just in terms of when they get promoted to the show or when they get promoted to AAA. And there's this really awesome graph that he included in that. I'm kind of the stats geek girl here, so forgive me for a second. But it shows you over time how African-American players actually have a substantially higher proportion of wins above replacement relative to their representation in the league. And so they're creating more value in the league, but they're underrepresented as an amount of that value. And I'm just wondering if either of you can talk to the reasons that happens. Like, why are these players not being valued at the level that they're capable of contributing when they get to the show?
Yeah, Sarah, I mean, that's excellent. It's funny you had that graph, and I did see that article, but I read an earlier rendition a few years when I was kind of looking into that fact. And it's interesting. One way to come into it is the anecdotal. I know coming up in the minor leagues, Black players, we'd kind of talk here and there as we gain these levels. We watch these players disappear, right? The diversity disappear. And we said, well, it's just harder to be a role player if you're Black. We used to say stuff like that. Like, didn't really have data or evidence. It just kind of felt like player A versus player B, the Black player would not get the benefit of the doubt. And I think that turned out to have a lot of truth in that data, for example, and I'll give you one example. I played with a guy named Micah Lewis, and Micah was very outspoken. He's kind of a middle infielder, second baseman, a good player. Played him in AA, but he was always reading, and he was reading, autobiography of Malcolm X. I mean, he was just very spoke out, and they started calling him Micah X, just that was it. And that became quite a weight on him. Not so much that he saw it was like dishonorable, but he knew that was probably going to hurt him. And I think there was another player who was drafted in the Twins. He was the Twins, and he was traded to the Cubs at some point, minor league. He said that one of the players that he was competing with, who was white, they actually called him in the office and told him that, you come from a good family, you come from a good background, we want to see you be successful, and it was kind of straight up, it was just very, So a lot of that, once again, didn't tie to data. And was that the exception to the rule? We weren't sure, but we just felt that. So that was sort of the anecdotal component to it. And I think that is such a compelling graph because, like you said, you always say whether you have to be twice as good or however you want to phrase it, that's like actual evidence. And the thing that I push on baseball, I wrote an article about 5 things baseball can do to address systemic racism. And one of the things I mentioned was, okay, we have all these incredible analytics departments, right? I mean, they're touted, they're like NASA engineers, they comb on, but why the blind spot? Why the blind spot in data like that? Why can't we either address that or see that or figure out, if you can solve that you should steal a base when Venus is on an eclipse with the third sun on a Wednesday, if we can do all that, then you can figure out how to hire people diversity. I mean, so I just think that there is some of these blind spots have been woven into it. And I'll give you a brief example. My first article I ever wrote for The Athletic was about managerial hiring. And the one thing that I kept coming back with, I was cool with Sandy Alderson, we used to have these discussions, was let's just look at the timeline. This is sort of indicative of how kind of American business can work in a very shadowy, but sometimes even unintended way, but it just sort of can have these racial implications. So let's go back to 1987. Al Campanis says what he says right on Nightline. I think it was Ted Koppel. And he says something about, blacks don't have the capabilities or something about managing, right? So he got buried for this incendiary quote about not being capable or managers, right? But I listened to the whole interview not long ago. And before he says something about capabilities and swimming and all that, he actually says, basically like, I'm going to summarize, but black folks aren't willing to go to the minors and pay their dues and go up the chain to be managers. It was sort of like that. And I thought that was actually became more compelling than even the kind of racially inflammatory comments, because he was saying, okay, you're not in the pipeline and you're not paying your dues. So therefore, how are we going to hire you? Now, even though he knew they control the pipeline or whatever, it was just sort of stated that way. So this is 40 years after Jackie Robinson broke in. That was the anniversary. And that's kind of what he said. Robinson's last speech publicly in baseball was in Cincinnati, where he said, I want to see blackface in the coach's box, something like that, right? So 87, it comes out. Now, gradually over time, these minor leagues start to kind of fill up with diverse candidates, Latin America, and gradually out. Now, think about where this actually goes. What happens in sort of the late 2000s, right? 2012, 11, like Mike Matheny when he gets hired, right around there with the Cardinals. The pipeline fills up with diverse candidates, and then the analytics revolution tells them that you don't need experience anymore. And so they all of a sudden the power structure says, wait a minute, you don't need all this pipeline minor league stuff. You just can be groomed and be a special assistant that's handpicked by the organization. We'll train you for 3 years and we'll laterally move you to be a manager. That's it. And it coincided with the pipeline finally being diverse. And so as a person of color, you look at that and it feels like a conspiracy. Like you're just moving the shell game around. But it was tied to this true revolution around analytics. Now, that's always been there to some degree, but not like it was. And so if you don't have the systematic checks to go, oh, wait, I need to have sort of equity audits in these policies to kind of see that it may be pernicious, it may be unintended, but there's this constant river flowing that kind of can create these discriminatory outcomes, right? And so in this case, you have, all right, so think about all the managers that were hired, right? Mike Matheny, Robin Ventura, Walt Weiss, Craig Counsell, Dan Jennings, Every single manager that was a beneficiary was a former player who had zero experience that was white. I mean, that's how it sort of played out. And it was like 9 or so hires in a row. Now and I did the research on that. Go back in time and look at the local newspapers of when these managers were hired. Now, these are great players, highly respected, qualified. It's just that the rules of qualification had shifted and it ended up excluding certain people because there wasn't a player who grew up in the Dominican Republic who was a special assistant to the Colorado Rockies. That wasn't happening. It was in Colorado Springs. So go back to these local newspapers, and a lot of the papers said, and I used it in the article, Walt Weiss, he's like, well, having experience is a negative thing. Like it literally changed even in the media coverage of it, that it became a negative. And that was totally antithetical to what Campanis was arguing. So I think there's a constant need, and to Levante's point is that representation can matter to a large degree of being in the room where it happens, right? My Hamilton thing, being in that room to kind of raise your hand and say, wait a minute now, like, I know if I was in that room, I would have raised my hand and said, wait a minute, why is all these lateral moves benefiting only one group of people? Like, why is that happening? Why are you changing the rules now to say now experience doesn't really matter and it's now this, and not looking at the total ripple effect. So I do think when you talk about value, Sarah, I think it is, when you hear these words like, well, they're not qualified or affirmative action, things like that. Well, who's really deciding what means quality or qualifications? It's power. And power, I'm going to go into my classroom mode. Eric Liu, power generally has 3 rules, according to Eric Liu. 1, power concentrates. So when you have it, you tend to concentrate it around like-minded, Theo Epstein said, right? Sort of concentrates it in, and it sort of ends up growing from this limited diversity, right? Then it also tends to justify itself. So when you have power, you tell stories to just justify why you're in power. So, and that's all about controlling the narrative. That's what narrative is about. So when Levante says representation, when you can tell a story of saying, hey, I grew up in Southside Chicago, and that story matters. And when power wants to justify itself, it will tell his story of these examples, these narratives. And so you have to rewrite these stories. And so that, and then there's a sense that, and this is where I think we have to look at inward as a society. Power is infinite. Now, people kind of disagree with that. And you talk about capitalism, right? There's a zero-sum game about, now if we apply that to the equity of having a diverse, inclusive society, that's problematic, because you're always saying, well, if I give you, and once again, the word is give, if I give you this managerial job, I'm taking away from either someone I like or know better, or who in my mind, I'm not saying it, is more qualified, right? So, but if you see power as infinite, you don't see it as some pie you're cutting up and I have to decide. You see it as like, we're better, and as a team, as a unit, because I'm elevating all of us to be better. And then together we actually go farther. And that's where we have to get at that core belief system around, do we believe power is this zero-sum game in these relationships? Because if you see it as a zero-sum game, you're always going to feel like I'm giving you something, you're taking something from me, and it's like a toddler kind of going back and forth. And that is very much against what a team is. Bate can talk about, right? You walk in and there's all these all-stars, but they don't play well together. They may not play well together. You have greatest individuals that have all this power, but when you actually coalesce around something, you don't need all-stars. Like, you could be a bunch of sort of middle-level players, but you coalesce and you beat the dream team, right? We were Mayagüez Los Indios in Puerto Rico, right? We beat up on San Juan in the finals, and they were, Roberto Alomar and Carlos Delgado, but they were like on vacation and they came and played this month. We were playing in the trenches from day one, from Hormigueros, with cold water showers from day one. And we didn't have an all-star team, but we became really good as a team, and we came together. So I do think that valuation is critical. And the only point I'll make to what we can do about it is you need these equity audits. You really do need, and I think people just, sometimes get offended, like, oh, you need to tell me to be fair to people, but it's just part of representation, and it's very human to have your biases. And we're trying to design, you have to design almost against it. You really have to design against it until it becomes the social norm and has power behind it.
Okay, I'm going to bring up. Can I bring up something you said about biases real quick? Sorry, Sarah. But
no, you're good.
I thought this was interesting. that says baseball gives us a chance to see ourselves in everyone, at times reflecting the image of some complex and difficult shadows in our society. That is a big step toward mutual understanding. As hard as it is, we need to see ourselves in the fans who are ejected. Having biases is human, our flawed yet efficient way to create shortcuts in our lives. But we need to check them more honestly if we are really to understand how to move forward. And I think that's kind of what you're saying. It's like we gotta check these biases. We got to look at them right in the face and understand that they exist in order to change what they are. So sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
Oh, no, you're great. I think that's an awesome quote that definitely goes with what we were just talking about. I just wanted to say, I think there's an opportunity here for some team to reimagine their analytics department and see value where other people are not seeing it. And I am not a Theo Epstein type, so I don't know exactly how you design that, but I do think that it's pretty clear there's a systemic undervaluation happening. So if you can be the team that can work your way out of that, you can really develop some players that other people are missing on.
And real quick, I just want to add, that's beautiful. Is that Doug's quote that you just put up, Danny?
Yeah.
And that's beautiful. And that is spot on because, listen, not even just talking about Major League Baseball or collegiate baseball. Let's be honest, guys. This goes all the way down to local league community ball. Think about that coach who has 15 players on his bench. And he sticks with a certain 10. There's 6 kids that never get in that game, no matter what, because this coach wants to win the pennant or the championship. And I dealt with that years ago. And that's why now at Lost Boys, we don't care as much about winning and losing. I've had, this year, my 14U squad, we're horrible, but I love those boys. And we go out and we have fun. And I've even got girls, that I brought over from softball who are playing because they can't get any, we're not getting softball games because of COVID. So they're showing up at practice all of the time. So I took some of them and said, hey, you want to come and play baseball and get a couple of games in? And well, anyway, I know we're terrible, but I'm putting everybody in. I'm making sure everybody bats, everybody gets some feedback from me. Everybody gets a chance to get a virtual high five. Good job. Yeah, you struck out. So what? You went in that box and you were aggressive. Those were the best 3 swings I've seen in my life. They probably were the 3 most horrible swings I've seen in my life. But I'm not going to tell that kid that, And so this differentiation of children starting then, that bias, that implicit bias we have, it follows us. And so to think about baseball is this is always about winning, And I was that kid when I started out playing that sat at the end of the bench because I was left-handed and she bought me a glove that went on my left hand. So I told that story the other day, right, Danny? For the whole first year of Little League, I tried to catch the ball, then take the glove off and then throw the ball back. And one day I got home and I'm like, Mom, you know what? I was like 7 or 8. I'm like, I'm the only one that takes my glove off and throw the ball, and everybody else has a glove on the other hand, Mom. I think we're doing something wrong. So, but that coach this is the serious part. The coach never told me. The coach never told my mom. He just sat me at the end of the dugout, me and the other kid that was a buster, and we dug holes there, and we played mini golf in the dugout while everybody else played games all season. And but that, when I reflect on it, that guy was horrible. He didn't even try to help me or develop me or give me an opportunity to play. It was just like, this kid sucks. I'm sticking him on the end of the bench. And that was due to me, his own biases of just wanting to win and put the best kids out there. And we were the Pirates. And he did have some of the best kids in the league. We had a kid named Smack. And no matter where they pitched the ball, they would try to give Smack, an intentional. And Smack would just reach up and still put it out, in right field somewhere. So, yeah, I just want to add that.
I want to kind of come in a little bit too here, because when we're talking about these ideas and these concepts and what Doug and kind of Levante both just addressed is when you think about the world from my perspective, or baseball or performance, especially in my job now and what I study now, what you see with a lot of people is you see like they have this one level of performance, and we can kind of apply this to the entire to Major League Baseball, to youth baseball, but we have a level where we are, and then we have a level that we're trying to get to. And I call that space in between the status quo and where we want to get. That's a performance gap. And what most people don't realize is that performance gap is rife with discomfort. It's rife with anxiety, and it's rife with fear of change moving forward. And as human beings, we always want to go back to the status quo. We always want to go back to what is comfortable. And I think that that's a pretty powerful explanation of how we continue to ingrain these biases that we all have as people. That's why when Theo talks about needing to do better because he's constantly bringing voices in that are like his, we do that because it's comfortable. We're more comfortable with people that look like us. And when you look at the history of front offices in Major League Baseball, when you look at the people who are running Little League and youth councils generally, there's a very common factor in what those people look like. And they are more likely or more apt to bring in people that look like and sound like and talk like them, because it can be uncomfortable not wanting to say the wrong thing in front of somebody else. It can be discomfort. And so if we're going to tell our players, like I do, that in order to improve, you need to lean into discomfort. You need to recognize that if you are comfortable, it's not, I don't know if I said this last week, but we like to talk in it's a very popular Twitter quote, right? To watch some guy running at 3 a.m. and then he says, you got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. I'm the opposite. I believe in the opposite perspective. And that's, if we're going to change, when we feel comfortable, especially coming from my place, my place of growing up in the suburbs with a privileged life and getting to live out my childhood dream and then work for this organization now. When I feel comfortable, it's time for me to find discomfort. And I think that if we took that just kind of general mind shift approach and shifted the mindset to looking for discomfort, having the uncomfortable conversations, and looking at areas where we're bad so that we can improve, I think that these problems, these issues, would reverse course a lot quicker. The problem with all of that is that people do not want to do that. People still don't want to do that. They're afraid of that discomfort, and it's understandable because that's just our natural way of being. I feel like we like to revert back to the status quo because that's nice, but to really have those conversations, they need to be out there. That's what this conversation is for. That's what our next one with Will Venable is going to be as well. It's about how do we lean into this discomfort? How do we, and this is, I'm going to ask, I guess, to Levante and Doug too, like, how do people like me, right, that get all the benefits of the dice roll of existence happened in my favor. When I became aware of where I was, it was with grass in the front yard and a bike to ride down the street and friends to play sports with outside and a dad to throw me BP, right? Like that's how I just woke up into that. How do we better serve as allies? How do we better serve to support the voices that need to be heard? And how do Cubs fans or people from the North Side that have traditionally watched, and we all know the demographics of Chicago. We've talked about this in the past on this show. How does that fan base make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a critical question, John. And I think we're talking about allies. You talk about trying to go forward, and I think there's a big aspect of it that you have to go backwards. You have to recognize how we got here, and part of it is there's a reckoning component to that history. For example, I was on this Connecticut Police Council call, and there's been much more calls to look at the history of policing, for example, just to go back to the roots and like, how did some of these systems get in place? And although chronologically, or I guess in a time sense, we're farther removed, we're still building on foundational elements that continue to reinforce something that was reinforced since 400 years ago in this supremacy, superiority, or just advantage and privilege. And it seems like it's invisible, but then in the walk of, as a man of color, it's very visible. It's very much. And I think one of the elements I use in my class is an iceberg. There's a guy Stroh, and I think you see when you're on the surface, you see what's out on the top, and you say, well, this is the summation of racism. I'm about to run into this. I'm the Titanic. about to hit this thing, and you can steer around it. And some people are actually in speedboats and other things around it. But then when you're experiencing race in America as a man of color, you're always dealing with what's below the surface, and you are actually submerged constantly. And so your worldview is around this experience, that it's much bigger. And it doesn't mean that perspective is wrong or right. I understand if you can only see the surface of that, what's above the surface, that is your experience. But I think it's incumbent upon us, because of its toxicity to our society and it's limiting where everybody can be at their best, that we are all invested interest in finding out what this whole iceberg is about. And so as an ally, when I got a call on a lot of the MLB. I did one of their speaker series, and it was a lot of diversity officers and many people who are part of the public face of their organizations. And so we engaged on this idea of this discomfort you're talking about, John, and the comfort sometimes implies that it works automatically, right? There's a certain privilege in being in status quo, because people don't want status quo when it's working against them, right? Or you feel like it's, laying on your neck, right? And literally and figuratively, you don't want status quo. And I think that challenge is shaky. It can shake the foundation when someone has such advantage in status quo, right? I mean, and it goes back to that zero-sum game question. But I think there's a lot of going backwards, looking at history, recognizing the connections between the systems that are at play today. And I think that in and of itself is a decent amount of work, right? Just to kind of bring history in some semblance of agreement coming to how we got here. And then you'll start to see housing discrimination. You'll start to see environmental inequity. You'll see hiring practices. You'll see all kinds of things. And when I wrote, one of the articles that I wrote about the comma effect was just about walking through baseball in my life, and just different moments I picked out that shows how I did not get the benefit of the doubt in all these circumstances. And no, none of them were clearly fatal or anything, but there were all these jabs at your dignity. I don't know if I don't know if you read that article, but in the story I tell, literally less than 2 or 3 weeks when I got drafted, I got called in the office in the New York Penn League as a Geneva Cub. And I was called in the office with 4 baseballs sitting on the desk of my manager and the staff. And they said, have a seat. I'm like, okay, that's weird. So I sat down and they said, we don't appreciate you stealing all these baseballs. I was like, stealing? Like, what are you talking about? Like, so they thought I'd stolen these baseballs. Now in the minors, baseballs are gold. They're not like the big leagues. You hit in the stands and you just like, so I get it. Like, baseballs matter and they're labeled and all that. And they have a Cubs C stamp on it. They called me in the office to accuse me of stealing baseballs, like 2 weeks into my professional career. And I was like, what are you talking about stealing? So I didn't know these guys that well, but I looked at the balls and they said NCAA, they said Cape Cod. They were baseballs from all my travels that I put my initials on it. And even when I presented the evidence with my initials written on it, they said that I could have written it on after the fact. They just did not accept it. And that was it. That was like my first professional debut. So it's one of those things where had I, being Black, I did not get that benefit of the doubt, where it was like, oh, okay, yeah. First of all, the baseballs were in my locker and I left them on the shelf. So it wasn't like I put them in my bag or whatever. So, so it's that type of experience I could review through so many other examples. Right. And the stories, as I said, the narratives matter to be able to tell those, and having the power and the platform to do so. And now I think in the ally is actually having the floor to listen and people hearing you and thinking of ways to actually make change. It's hard. It's very hard, and change takes time. The first assignment in my class is a letter that Jackie Robinson wrote to Martin Luther King in 1960, and then King responded. And Robinson was actually critical of King for not getting involved in some of the infighting between the SCLC and the NAACP. And ultimately, you saw that he envisioned and understood that the NAACP has a role and the SCLC has a role, and we want the same goals. We may have different objectives, but they're both significant. Just like an ally, as Brenda Tracy would say, if it was up to me to stop sexual violence and harassment on college campuses and in athletics, and it was up to women, it would have disappeared already. But you have to recognize that a lot of who are perpetrating these issues are men, and they need to actually stand up. And often it's 10% of the people that may be perpetrating horrible things personally and systematically, but it's the 90% of the people that are silent, and too often silent. And to call it out and to speak on it and to be in the boardroom, because a lot of these people who would speak out aren't in the boardrooms. And that's the responsibility. So yeah, it's a tall order, but our common friends, our families, our teammates are struggling and literally dying in some circumstances. And therefore it takes all of us.
Yeah, and I have to say, Doug, I really I wouldn't say enjoyed is the right word, but your conversation that you had recently with Jimmy Rollins and Torrey Hunter, and I found that was I believe that's out on YouTube for everybody. I heard the podcast on Starkville, which you're a common contributor to, but like some of those stories are harrowing, like Torrey, having the gun at his back in his own home and things like that. Yeah. And you hear things and last year when we were working together, when you were doing the post game and we were doing the Outside the Ivy show, there was that incident at Wrigley Field where, the guy making the racist symbol. And then there was a lot, and you wrote about ambiguity, these ambiguous symbols that, people can look at and say, oh, that's not racist. You're overreacting. And then you look like the crazy person and like all that stuff. And that's, I think, one of the reasons I personally was incredibly motivated to kind of like take on this mantle with John right now to have these conversations, because I wanted to approach it from a fan standpoint, because it is going to take everybody. It's going to take changing perceptions. And I think in order to change perceptions, for me to shut up and listen and walk a mile in somebody's shoes for 5 seconds and imagine what that would be like if it had happened to you or your brother or your cousin or your mother or whoever it is, because I think too often people like to check the box on somebody and say, oh, that's how they are, or that was racist, or that wasn't. And, what you wrote about ambiguity, I'm just going to put that up really quick. Ambiguity can make people of color feel that their sanity hinges on a single verdict. If the Cubs fan was flashing a white nationalist sign, we are in danger. If he was not, we are politicizing things or race baiting. This is an incapacitating position to find yourself in, especially when you are just an innocent bystander. You are now forced to redundantly relitigate the existence of racism from a defensive position. And, I mean, that just illustrates, I think, exactly why we all wanted to have this conversation. Of course, George Floyd being murdered by that police officer was definitely like kind of a moment of time for everybody to kind of spring into action.
Can I also add too that I think that a big part of this conversation, and at least from the majority side, is the difference between overt and covert behavior and things that are happening. I think that's what we're addressing here, is like what happened to George Floyd was overt and on camera. But what happens to other people, whether it be called into the manager's office and accused of stealing baseballs, or I can give an example just from my experience of working, and I don't think that necessarily the people that I work with are racist, but a few years ago when I first got this job, I went down to Eugene to watch our short season team. And one of the players was a younger black player that was really struggling. And the reports on him were that he wasn't hustling. He wasn't trying hard. He wasn't putting in the right amount of effort. And so I said, well, has anybody talked to him about it? No, we haven't talked to him, but man, he better run harder or he's going to get this label. Obviously the label was already there. And so I pulled the player aside and I said, this is what I'm hearing about you. And I would rather just tell you and have this awkward conversation so that you can correct this, or we can figure out a solution to the issue. And the solution that we came up with, and I think this is just kind of a powerful anecdote or microcosm of it, was, hey, let's just try to run fast enough when we like pop up or hit a fly ball to see if we can get people to change their opinion. If you can just coast, because he could run well. If you could just coast and make it look like you're running hard, I bet you the thing will change. And it did. And it did. Now, I have never heard anything like that about a white player. I've never heard it before. I've never seen something like that where it's like I'm watching the game with baseball players' eyes and recognizing that this kid's trying his best, right? He's trying his best. He's struggling. He's trying his best. But the view from the outside, it's so easy for people who, again, this is the covert racism that pervades the way that we're raised a lot of the time, is that we see that as lazy with one and as acceptable with the other. I think another good example of this, and it recently was Javi hit a pop-up the other day that accidentally went fair, right? And there's questions about to David Ross about if Javi's hustling. Is Javi hustling? And it's like, do you watch the other 99.9% of the way he plays? The kid who's diving all over the field, who's yelling out of the dugout all the time at the other team, who's constantly in the game, who one of the most beautiful things ever now is that there's no fans in the stands. So you can hear Javi calling strike 3 before the ball gets there from shortstop because he's so into the game. You watch this guy play. I played with this guy. And I thought when those questions were asked, I thought, man, if that was Schwartz or if that was KB or somebody, would the reporter ask the same question? And it's just another example of our covert bias that kind of pervades all of these questions. And again, if you do bring this up, like we have this conversation, and it makes it uncomfortable to people that ask those questions, it's just like Doug had written in that article. Now it's race baiting. Now it's politicizing these things, but what if the things that we're politicizing are political and they're real and they need to be confronted for us to move forward? And I feel like if I can learn this perspective from where I came from, if I can learn this perspective, I don't think it's inaccessible to everybody else. It's just going to force a little bit of a higher heartbeat, some sweaty palms, and the occasional butterflies in the stomach. But anybody, again, back to performance. Anybody that performs knows that those are positive things. That anxiety, that worry, those physiological symptoms, those are the doorway to greatness and the doorway to improvement and the doorway to change. We just have to really lean into it, grab that door handle, and step through and see the people on the other side.
Yeah, man. Well said, Bake. I mean, I think that when you talk about, Danny, the experience at Wrigley, it's something that I brought up in that call with a lot of the MLB officials, and the media is part of this, right? And I'm in the media, but everybody's trying to unlearn some things as well as learn some things, right? There's a component of, one of my courses in one of the days, one of the weeks, we talk about headlines and wordplay and the power of these words. And it's something as simple as, like you said, the ambiguity of it falling one way or the other. And if the media is covering it a certain way, some of that goes back to representation. We talked about Levante, but it's also partly just really checking our own biases and being aware. And, it's human. It's very difficult. I mean, I think in that article, I also mentioned that, from the policing, I learned a lot about bias training. And, they say, well, when you're driving a car and you turn the steering wheel to the left, you don't think through like, oh, my shoulder's got to tilt at 33 degrees. You don't have to think about all these things. That is bias. That's how bias operates, because it's a shortcut allowing us to function in the world where we don't have to relearn everything all the time. So your body and your brain creates all these shortcuts. So that is a necessity, but it doesn't work very well with people, right? It doesn't work very well with people because now we're bringing in institutional history and racism and all these things that are overlapping, and we're seeing a crime that's not there or whatever. All that is very complicated by people. And so, with the ambiguity that, in my case, there's an intentional movement out there to be ambiguous on purpose. Okay. That's no doubt about it. It's to say, oh, well, if you take it this way, I'm going to call you out for race baiting. But if you take it the other way, and ignore it like I sort of want to pretend that I meant, then all my people that I'm really secretly whispering to and dog whistling to will understand, right? So it's an impossible position. But what was interesting is, working on the solution or working through that incident at Wrigley and talking to the Cubs, I knew that eventually there was a timeline. Like, no organization in these public spaces, and it's different a little bit now, but wants to keep racism at Wrigley in the news cycle every day for, it's just not. And I think so part of what Bake was asking about is, you do kind of have to keep the foot on the accelerator on these things, right? It's easy to say, well, the news cycle's over, right? I just don't want to deal with this anymore. Racism is now retired, because we have to play baseball. Yeah, you have a business, but there's such an opportunity to engage. And if you make it part of your value system, then you don't have to think about it, right? You don't have to be like, well, should I end this thing here? Like, it's part of your value. Just like I would say it's one thing to stand for something. It's another to stand up for something. And there's differences. And you could say like, hey, I stand for inclusion. I mean, that's not controversial. But when you stand up and people are threatening it, you're going to fight. You're going to fight for it. You're going to counter it. You're not going to tolerate. That's a different position. And think about Jackie Robinson, right? 1947 breaks in, retires 10 years later. We celebrate him in baseball to a degree, the numbers, but we're also missing like the second half of this man's life. I mean, he was marching on the streets. He opened a bank. He was the first columnist. This guy, chock full of nuts executive. He was debating Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon. He was writing letters to everybody under the sun in protest and all for equality. I mean, that's Jackie Robinson too. He criticized, talked about the flag and talk about like his second class citizenship. So why don't we embody that guy too? Like that would actually do quite a bit. Not just the Joe Robinson, the first 3 years of his career, who couldn't really speak out. Right. So, and I think some of that speaks to how sometimes, and it's harder now with social media, is we're picking out the convenient parts of a person's life. And in some ways we should, the other side of that is we should try to be forgiving, right? I mean, there's, whether you cancel someone or all these things, I understand certain extreme things probably need to be canceled, but I think you also miss the lessons. If you cancel the lessons, you take a very glass house approach, like, well, no, I'm not that. And that's what makes, unfortunately, some of these responses too easy. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to issue our bullet point template statement. Like this is not who we are. We stand against racism. Okay, that's cool. And I think that helps, but then you better have some idea of what's next, right? And because people will start calling you out saying, wait a minute, weren't you the one that with the 500 discrimination lawsuits against you? And, aren't you the same company that's, so, I think that's definitely happening more, that you're forcing people to get beyond the words. And as Bake said, it's uncomfortable. It is. And these conversations are not easy, but I know from my experience growing up, I realized the power of exposure because I'm actually comfortable in these conversations, because I was constantly having to, okay, I have a police officer as my coach and my teammates from here. And, we're all different. And we saw the George Floyd thing together, but then we have our own dissection. When you're in that environment a lot and you have the exposure, it's helpful. And which speaks to also the power of diversity. It's not just to color by numbers and be like, yeah, we have this person in the room. It's actually to empower us to be better. We have to invest in that belief that we are better, because we have these different perspectives brought to the table. That's it's got to be something fundamental. And then I think it's a lot easier from there once you sort of embrace that.
Well, I'm definitely here to work as hard as I can to, at least from what I can do with whatever voice I have as a podcaster and kind of a media person within the Cubs fan world, to at least try to continue this conversation moving forward and not just give up by like, okay, we put out our, like you said, like oh, I put out a statement. I believe racism's wrong. Like that's an easy answer, but I think it's a lot harder to be an anti-racist, which is so if you'll indulge me real quick, we are selling this shirt and face mask, and all the money from it through Obvious Shirts is going to go to the Lost Boys and Levante. So we got the John Baker Day face mask, which is really cool. I bought 2. And the anti-racist shirts now coming in men and women styles with the little John Baker Day logo on the side sleeve. So that's really cool. We're doing a lot of different things to try to raise money. Go to johnbakerday.com. We finally got around to buying that. I didn't do it, but a friend, Kevin Michael Davis, was like, Danny, you're an idiot. Why didn't you buy John? Somebody's going to sneak down and get John Baker Day. I was like, oh, yeah, well, I'm not really a website guy, but, you know. So anyway, he did it for me. Now that's all pointing in the right direction. But, yeah, I think that's why we're here, Doug and John and Levante and Corey and Sarah, you know, it's just and everybody else that's been involved in these conversations. From the Sun Ranto show, Ivy Envy, and Cup of Cubby Blue that's why we're doing this. We're doing the hard work. I really appreciate you spending so much time with us, Doug. You know, it's an hour and a half. I know you were on the phone all day with the police council and stuff, and now you jump on here, and I just really appreciate all your insight and, man, all the articles. I mean, I could read you all day, so you know. To keep writing, please, because I want to read more. And
I just want to autograph baseball in a picture next time he's in Chicago, because y'all can't see my legs, but I'm like, you remember the kindergartners when you sitting in the chair and their feet don't touch the floor and they're excited about something that's just swinging and crisscrossing? I've been like that the whole hour and a half. Just in my head, it's like John Baker, Doug Glanville, John Baker, Doug Glanville. Ah!
Well, I tell you, Doug, if I had known last year in the green room that your autographed baseball card was going for $14, I would have just I just would have been back there having you sign card after card after card and supplementing my income and yours too. We could have I would have done all the legwork. But
you sure those are dollars? It might be like, you know.
Yeah, look at it. $14.
Right,
that's eBay right there.
I thought that might have been cents or something.
Only
Nice.
2 left in stock. So just so you know, all you have to do, you don't even have to work anymore. All you got to do is sit around and sign baseball cards.
I
and make
gotta
money.
I gotta find those cards. It might be somewhere around here.
I feel like that's one of the first baseball cards I've seen of like oh, look at that.
This is I do have my Sammy Sosa nesting doll here.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So
yes,
yeah.
Russian
This has gotta be
Sammy Sosa
valuable.
dolls.
Mark Bellhorn is in here. There's a Bellhorn. So you never know what you might find in there.
Mark Bellhorn, Fenway legend. I was
Fenway
going to say, Doug,
legend.
that's excellent secondary lead in that baseball card. That was
That's right.
I could tell exactly where you were on the field. And I just want to, just for me to close, you know, last year, I was really proud of the way our organization handled domestic violence. It's very easy for us to choose it in a polarizing way. You know, the treatment of Addison Russell online by fans was something that was really painful for me to go through with that person. And when you look at issues like that, what you realize is, and pardon the pun here, these issues are not black and white, and becoming part of the solution involves walking directly into it and investigating it at the deepest levels possible. And that's just my encouragement to everybody else. The same thing that we did in handling that case last year, and what we had to go through and taking everybody's opinion. And I'm talking about everybody involved in the incident's opinions, the people that were there on the ground. It's so easy for us to virtue signal and say, like, I stand against domestic violence, but it's really hard for us to say, not only do I stand against it, but as Doug was just saying, I'm going to choose to be active by facing it head on and figuring out how I can make a difference and I can contribute so that it doesn't happen to another woman somewhere else. I feel like it's our responsibility to take the same perspective in this one as well, which is the only way we're going to get to the equity that we seek is through this discomfort, is through facing things head on, and is to continuing to foster these conversations and promote the voices of people like Levante and Doug, well, the organization Levante, and then Doug, your voice, so that more people have access to hearing what I would consider is the truth and also the right kind of learning platform. Like, not everybody has to go and read Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist book. If you appreciate baseball, you can go to lostboysinc.org. You can find Doug's articles on The Atlantic, and you can listen to this conversation, and hopefully it helps push the ball more progressively forward in your mind, because that's what we're looking for. You know, as we say, when guys are having a tough day at the plate, what you want to think about as a hitter is, can on this pitch I get us closer to scoring a run? And I kind of urge that same mentality here. How can we make the boat go faster? How can we have a 0.001% aggregate gain? Because if we're moving forward, we're not moving backward.
Yeah, man.
I like it. All right. Well, I guess we could just wrap it up there. But thank you so much, Doug. I really appreciate it. Levante, Sarah, Corey, John. I really appreciate these conversations. We're going to be breaking this down on. I'm going to release this pretty much right away, but we're going to break down this conversation a little bit on Sunday with a bunch of the podcasters. Cut it up, maybe dig a little bit deeper into some of the things that we talked about today. So for all you guys watching and for everybody here on this panel, I just thank you all for being here, and just appreciate all your time, Doug. I really appreciate it. And John and Levante, and John, be careful in St. Louis.
Yeah.
Be careful. It's a very boring town, but it could sneak up and bite you.
I'll come and get you, Coach.
Thank you for unboring St. Louis for me.
Yeah.
It is no longer boring because of this conversation. I'll make sure I tell KB about it too, so that he can also.
Yeah, make sure Chris Bryant has a T-shirt or something.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and have a great day, everybody.
All right, guys, take care.